Hey guys, Randy here with BRStv Guide to Mastering Your Neptune Apex controller, where it's all about using your Apex to improve your gear's performance. And today, we're talking feeding your fish, feeding your corals, and how your Apex can not only handle most of your tank's feeding workload for you, but also in the same breath do so more diligently, more intelligently, and more accurately. There's 3 Apex tools we're going to use today to feed your tank smarter and easier. First is with customized feed modes that automatically turn off gear, like your skimmer, return pump, power heads, and others, with a push of a button, keeping more food in the tank and giving your fish and corals time to capture the food. Second is the Neptune AFS, not just to automate daily feeding when you're not home, but using automatic feeding to avoid overpolluting the tank, reducing fish aggression, broadcast feeding coral foods, and diversify your fish's diet. While the third, we'll explore the Neptune DOS at taking over your coral and fish feeding needs for aminos, liquid eggs, or pods, and other feeding additives. So let's kick things off by setting up those customized feed modes, which I have to tell you, this is one of the main features that attracted me to my first Apex, especially after getting fed up with chasing cords around and unplugging gear like my ATO, skimmer, return pump just to feed my fish, or turning off power heads to feed my A-cans, and occasionally forgetting to turn something back on. Not only that, but it's also hard to stomach watching half of your fish food go down the drain and into the sump before your fish have time to grab it. Okay, so solving this is probably one of the most simple things to set up on your Apex, because there's only one line that you need to add to the gear that you want to control. I like to use feed mode A when feeding, so just find the gear icon for your skimmer, return pump, ATO, and or power heads, and add in a line that says, if feed A 000, then off. This will automatically turn off your equipment for 5 minutes, and you can walk away knowing that everything will turn back on automatically. Now here's a few extra tips to customizing those feed modes for your tank's specific needs. And the first is to make sure that you put the feed A line above any defer lines that might be in your outlet. For example, your skimmer and ATO, which we set up in previous episodes, both have a defer line that waits 5 minutes for the sump level to even out before coming back on. So my feed mode A line goes in above that. Also, if 5 minutes is shorter than you need to feed your fish and corals, you can simply adjust the length of time using the miscellaneous icon from the dashboard and changing the length using seconds, like 600 seconds for 10 minutes instead of 5. Third tip, use another feed mode for feeding different foods. For example, I can use feed mode A for feeding fish, where I only need 5 minutes to shut down my return, skimmer, and ATO, but keep my power heads on. But use feed mode B for feeding corals, where I shut down everything, including my power heads, for 10 minutes. In that case, all you need to do is adjust the runtime like we did and add a new line to your pump, skimmer, and ATO that says, if feed B 00, then off. And then add the feed B line to your power heads. The last feed mode tip is pretty cool if you're using the Neptune core return pumps and the Neptune wave power heads, where instead of just powering them completely off during your feeding, you can actually decrease their intensity to a specific percentage. So with the Core 15 and the Core 20, feed mode setup is built into the core task function, so you only need to choose your related feed mode. But with the wave pumps, changing feed mode intensity is super easy by simply adding a line feed mode that says, if feed A 00, then 30, which will turn the wave pump intensity down to 30% when you hit your feed mode, making it easier for your fish to grab the food, and you can change that last number to anything from 0 to 100%. All right, let's talk about that AFS automatic feeding system next and how much it can transform your tank and feeding habits without even lifting a finger. There's a laundry list of issues that the automatic feeding can resolve, the most obvious of them being able to feed your fish when you decide to take that long weekend away from home or a yearly vacation. Again, this is one of those must-have Apex tools for my tank, because I was usually out on the lake on the weekends or taking a road trip home to see my family, and hiring my friend to swing by and feed my tank was not only expensive and hard to coordinate, but not always an option. However, beyond that, setting up an AFS auto feeder has other perks, like keeping those high energy anthias or other fish constantly fed to better meet their nutritional needs, reducing fish on fish aggression because there's a reliable food source with plenty to go around, making nitrate and phosphate management much easier with adjustable portion sizes and frequency throughout the day, especially if you happen to be one of those heavy-handed feeders. varying up your tank's diet by using more than one AFS with different types of food and on different schedules, supplementing your tanks and other herbivorous fish diets using seaweed-based pellets alternatively to nori, which also keeps your hands out of the tank. And you can even use your AFS for feeding corals particulate food like reef chili or reefroids or something similar automatically, especially if you have a tank filled to the brim with corals that just doesn't support your just morning and evening regular feeding. So setting up your AFS is also extremely easy to do because there's a task function for you that does all the work. Just choose the AFS task, choose your AFS, rename it if you want. Like for me, this will be my coral food AFS. Choose the time of day you want your first feeding to start, like noon, and then pick how many rotations for each feeding and how many feedings per day. Note that if you do need more than one feeding per day, in the next field you can choose the length of time between each feeding. And lastly, tie your AFS to a feed mode of your choice, then hit the send button. Now all you have to do is kick back and let the AFS take the wheel, but there are a few tips that I've picked up for getting your AFS dialed in that you should take into consideration. Ryan and I have done an entire top AFS mistakes video with all kinds of pointers for this one, so check that out a bit later. But the first thing you'll want to do after setting up your AFS is to find the right portion size for each feeding. We found the easiest way to do that is with a paper plate under your feeder, then just toggle the outlet on, then back to auto to start a drum rotation, and then adjust the portion size accordingly using the sliding door on the AFS. Along with adjusting portion size, it's a good idea to monitor nitrates and phosphates a little more closely after first setting up your auto feeder to help you more accurately adjust the portion size and feeding frequency. Basically, if your nitrates and phosphates start trending upward, just lessen the amount of feeding times each day or close the portion control door a little less to feed less, and vice versa if they're trending down. I definitely recommend using the Apex logging tool to keep track of your nitrates and phosphates during this time, which gives you an easy to read historical graph that allows you to add comments and notes like changed from 2 times per day to 3 times. 2 other tips I'd keep in mind for your AFS is 1, remember triggering the AFS feed mode is a great way to feed on demand, but will also trigger everything else that you have tied to that same feed mode. This is probably not an issue for many of you who set up your feed mode specifically for that purpose, but if you wanted to feed on demand without triggering all the other gear, you can simply toggle the AFS outlet to on for a few seconds, then back to auto, which will run a feed cycle and then resume its regular schedule. And the last tip for your AFS before we dive into the Neptune DOS, actively watch the amount of food in your drum and get a good idea of when it needs to be replenished. The last thing you want to do is take off for the weekend and think that your tank is being fed when it's not, which makes this a great task to add to your Apex calendar, like I did here with an AFS top-off reminder every 3 weeks. All right, next we're talking about the Neptune DOS, which takes over hand dosing of coral foods like some of these from KZ and Red Sea, and amino acids like Brightwell Coral Amino or KZ Amino, as well as some fish foods like dock eggs or these liquid form concentrate foods from Nios. And using a doser for feeding these types of foods will take a little more effort and attention to not overdo it, but setup is extremely easy to do quickly, and you can get pretty creative with how elaborate your dosing setup can get, which could be as simple as sterilizing your dosing lines and putting a dosing tube into shelf-stable foods that don't need refrigeration, or as fancy as a small fridge in your fish room or near your tank that you've carefully tapped into with a dosing line to keep your foods fresh. I'll share a link a bit later to Neptune's super helpful video on how to properly set up your dose for refrigerated foods with tips on cleaning out the lines after feeding so your food doesn't spoil. In either case, there's only a single task function you need to have your dose set up and ready to go. Just find the dose additive task, choose the left or right dosing head you have set up, rename it something easy to remember. For me, that's Coral Amino. Then choose how many mils per day during what time of day you want to dose and hit send. That's all there is to it, and when you need to adjust the dose, you can either go back and run the task function all over again, or just hit the gear icon on your dosing head, choose modify interval, and change the dose. But there are a few other tips that you should know as well. That first Neptune DOS tip for using it as an auto feeder, prime and calibrate your dose with water before hooking it to your food amino source so you know it's as accurate as possible and you don't waste aminos. Second, there's 2 dosing heads, so why not use them both? One for aminos, one for foods. Third, it's best practice to clean out your dosing lines from time to time, and here's my tip for doing that. Click on the gear icon for your dosing head from the wizard dosing schedule, choose modify interval, change the action to remove, save it, and you're ready to clean. So in this configuration, your dosing head will now rotate counterclockwise when you flip the outlet to on, meaning it will push your food or coral amino back into the bottle, and once the lines are clear, you can run some RODI water through the lines for a few minutes to help flush them out. Just remember to go back into the dose wizard and change the action back to add before you start your dosing schedule again. Here's one more food dosing tip. Although the dose is capable of some pretty long runs like we showed in the Master Your Apex water change episode, if you're using your dose for refrigerated foods, try to mount everything as close to your tank as possible to minimize the amount of foods that remain in the dosing lines and begin to warm up. Here's that link to the Neptune's video to set this up properly if you want to try this out for yourself, along with our entire Master Your Apex series playlist. Enjoy.